25 years since the Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide was founded, but its history goes back to 1881 when the Henry Martyn Trust was founded in memory of Henry Martyn, the great missionary to India and Persia. Henry Martyn studied in Cambridge and was a fellow of St. John's College. And the year 1881 was the first birth centenary year of Henry Martyn. He was born in 1781. And some people in Cambridge who were influenced by his zeal and commitment to world mission set up the Henry Martyn Trust to honor him. The trust worked to encourage students in Cambridge who were interested in undertaking and participating in world mission. The Henry Martyn Library, which was and is at the heart of the work of the trust, played a central role in this. As there was a specialized library in world Christianity and resources to undertake research and research projects in collaboration with the Faculty of Divinity in the University of Cambridge, as well as with the Cambridge Theological Federation, Graham Kings, who was then mission lecturer in the Federation, founded the Henry Martyn Center in 1996. And Cambridge Center for Christianity Worldwide is our name now. Celebrating our Silver Jubilee, we are very pleased to organize 5 Silver Jubilee lectures this year on the theme Transfiguring World Christianity. We have selected this theme to highlight the ways Christianity has transfigured as it has encountered new contexts, cultures, and communities. Yet figuring out the changes and the many issues and concerns arising due to them, as well as responding to these changes, is a continuing task for us working in the areas of world Christianity and mission. Particularly the changes during the last few decades in terms of world Christianity or worldwide Christianity are significant, as we are aware. Under this theme, the 5 Silver Jubilee lectures are about figuring out different issues and concerns we have and face in the context of world Christianity. Today's lecture is about solidarity in the context of the pandemic. And the future topics are public engagement, science and world Christianity, ecumenism, and reconciliation. More details about the Silver Jubilee lectures are available on our website, cccw.cam.ac.uk. If you'd like to get a copy of the flyer, please get in touch with us at sender@cccw.cam.ac.uk. Or you may leave your email in the chat box or contact us and we will be in touch with you. With these words, now I hand over to Graham to chair the session and introduce our speaker, Joanildo.
Many thanks indeed, Mutaraj. And it's very good to see so many friends online. In particular, it's great to see Joanildo, Professor Joanildo Burity is a very good friend. We first met at the Anglican Consultative Council meeting in Lusaka in Zambia in 2016, and then again at Recife in 2017 for a conference. It's a joy that you're with us. You're a Brazilian academic, an Anglican layperson. Your PhD was from Essex University, and you've done extensive research on religion and politics in Brazil. You're a leading researcher and professor at the Joaquim Nabuco Foundation, a social research center, and a postgraduate teaching fellow in sociology and politics at the Federal University of Pernambuco, both in Recife in Brazil, and an active member of the Anglican Diocese of Recife and served as provincial representative to the Anglican Consultative Council. It's a joy that you're with us today. The shape of this afternoon is going to be a lecture from Joanildo for 45 minutes, and then we're going to go into randomized groups for 10 minutes of 5 people, and then we will come together and put our questions and have a plenary. So over to you, Professor Burity. Solidarity, figuring out world Christianity and the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bishop Graham. Thank you very much, Dr. Swami, for the very kind invitation to be sharing with you in this series of lectures. It's a pleasure to be part of this and to bring my modest contribution to the project. And I hope, and also to be able to see some very good friends, such as Musraj and Bishop Graham again. Good to see Jenny again, because I think we met some other time before. And of course, other people who are joining today for this conference. I'm going to share with you a presentation, which I hope will work. So the general question that I think will underlie most of what I'm going to present to you is a general change across Latin America, though I'm going to focus on the Brazilian case, a general trend towards a new form of public religion, away from the traditional Catholic presence in culture and politics in most of our countries. We have had a number of changes over the last 30, 40 years that kind of brought religion back into the public arena, but showing different actors, different groups, different agendas even. So a growing religious activism has taken place across the continent, following a very broad trend to revalue and make way for minority demands, which doesn't necessarily translate as small group demands, because some of these minorities are actually numerically very large, even majorities, if we just take quantities as a reference. So Afro-descendants in Brazil, they make up over 50% of the population, but they are in that sense a minority, because historically they have been treated as a discriminated group or just ignored in their needs and demands by many governments. In Brazil, part of this minority emergence has had to do with a very powerful visibility of Pentecostalism. Pentecostals had already been the majority of Brazilian Protestants since the 1950s, but from the 1980s onwards, they have grown and reached around 65%. At some point in the 90s, they were almost 70% of all Brazilian Protestants. And this is a figure which can also be more or less, said to represent the average across South America, as far as Protestant groups are concerned. So basically what we're talking about here is Latin American Protestantism has become largely Pentecostal. And if we add to specific Pentecostally called churches, those charismatic groups within traditional denominations, then it's a massive representation of charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity. Well, as a result of this growth, numerical growth, there were many initiatives that resulted in a very large presence, a very high profile of evangelical Pentecostal groups in Brazilian politics. As a result, we've seen and heard more of religious language and symbols, but also as they become public, as a feature of public religion, they also come under contention. So the legitimate use of these symbols and this discourse are disputed, are challenged by other religious and non-religious groups. And sometimes there are also questions about how appropriate or even admissible these new features of public discourse can be. But that has also meant this kind of religious presence in public has attracted, has managed to surround, to join in, but also to be surrounded by non-religious political forces. And in that sense, we are talking about public religion as part of a wider trend in democratic politics from the mid-80s onwards, in which secular and religious boundaries become very blurry and difficult to stabilize in one direction or another. On the other hand, from the early 2010s, we've seen a number of trends showing growing discontent among conservative Christians, and that includes evangelicals, Pentecostals, Catholics, in relation to the advances, to the changes that minoritarian minded policies generated in the country. So we've seen very clearly a backlash, an anti-minoritarian backlash taking place, led or to a significant degree, finding conservative Christians as those who most forcefully call against such minoritarian policies, legal rights, and so on. So in place, we've seen a growing struggle for what's been called traditional values, coupled with forms of Christian politics that resemble the post-Reaganite evangelical new Christian, new right in the US, though this comparison can sometimes be misleading. It can also somehow bring to our mind this kind of connection between traditionalism or conservatism about values with neoliberal views on economic policies and social rights, and more recently, still quite openly right-wing, even fascistic forms of political discourse. Well, the pre-pandemic's background in Brazil then show us a number of evangelical Pentecostal success stories in terms of growth, cultural impact, political advances, joining the very traditional form of coalition politics that's prevailed in Brazil since the 1930s, and largely meaning that no political force has been able to secure a stable, undisputed majority in Brazilian politics for many, many decades. And this has led to the need for negotiating coalitions, both in electoral terms and in the formation of administrations or government cabinets. So this has also meant that in order to negotiate these broad coalitions, a number of very different demands and projects have had to be accommodated within a working environment. But this sharing is many times uneasy because there's a lot of ideological, variance within these coalitions, and sometimes there are very clear internal disputes for, more control of governmental agencies, more control of the legislative agenda, and so on and so forth. When we reach, this had an inflection. There was a turn in the Brazilian context by the early 2000s when we had, for the first time, through democratically run elections, a kind of center-left, but very clearly led by a left-wing party coalition developed and came to power. with Lula, a very well-known labor leader from the 1970s, leading that coalition. And Pentecostal churches, particularly the largest of them, the Assemblies of God, and the largest Neo-Pentecostal church, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, being drawn into this alliance from the very early days throughout the electoral campaign, and also coming to be part of the new governmental arrangements. Not so much at top level. There were very few ministers in cabinet that came from evangelical Pentecostal backgrounds, but they managed to have access to a lot, several leading positions within government. This meant that for many of those people coming from evangelical or Pentecostal backgrounds, it was the first time they actually had an experience of direct involvement in politics. And already they needed to share that with groups with much larger experience, but also groups with very different agendas that either resisted any kind of religious presence in politics, explicit religious presence in politics, or resisted that particular kind of agenda Pentecostals and conservative evangelicals brought into the public debate. Well, by 2010, there had been a number of tensions within that coalition, and we start to see a process of decoupling between the more conservative voices within the coalition and those center-left and left that had so far been able to keep things under a certain working order as a governmental project. And after that, by then, 2010, we had elections in 2010. And after that, the questions around abortion, then questions about LGBT rights, questions about corruption come to take more and more space in the Brazilian governmental and political circles. And through that, we begin to see the emergence of a number of trends towards that would show and prove to be a form of conservative reaction against coalitional, not necessarily coming from a single position, but voicing for a variety of conservative agendas, and very successful in terms of ending up ousting a legitimately elected president under allegations of corruption that 2 or 3 years later proved to be completely untenable and false. In any case, that led to a new chapter in Brazilian politics in which evangelicals and Pentecostals then became very prominent figures, leading electoral campaign projects, taking more space into top positions in power, and turning or helping turn Brazilian politics very much towards a more conservative and sometimes clearly right-wing direction. We begin to see all these debates that I think are widespread post-2008, 2010, under different umbrellas or themes generated by different kinds of questions in different parts of the world, but still producing very similar results. Polarization, so-called culture of hate or hatred culture, a very embattled public arena where many things are fought over in very antagonistic ways. And from the conservative quarters, this very aggressive rhetoric and predicated on their right to exercise their conscience, their freedom of speech, and sometimes their constitutional rights to organize and publicly mobilize. As a result, we see talk of a new Christian majority emerging, called for by mostly by Pentecostal pastors turned representatives in Congress, or taking up positions as ministers. For instance, a very well-known woman from a Pentecostal church, not the Assemblies of God, but another Pentecostal church that emerged in the, I think, the 1950s in Brazil, the Square Gospel Church, and leading the new ministry for women and human rights, and completely turning on its head whatever we could understand by those expressions up until that moment. Well, that leaves us with a number of fault lines among Christians and churches. And part of that could be seen to represent the emergence of some kind of Christian identity politics, in which the languages of democratic contestation and rights claiming turn into a hegemonic game, vying for control of society and the state more broadly, and through that control, some kind of influence that some people understood in much stronger terms as a kind of Christian control of the new situation. This is animated by the emergence of a new evangelical and Pentecostal elite, post-2010, that's much more openly conservative, that again, and for the first time since the late 1980s, when Brazil institutionalized its democracy after 20 years of military rule, we begin to see people who outspokenly identify themselves as right-wing, and many of them come from Christian quarters, particularly evangelical and Pentecostals. Well, that leads to a successful electoral campaign in 2018 that brings Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right politician, nominally Catholic, but very close to this new, very conservative evangelical political elite, to become president and take in office from early 2019. During the electoral campaign, we see a very clear divide in terms of a 70% majority of evangelicals voting for Bolsonaro, and 30% of them deciding to vote for the Workers' Party candidate. During that electoral process, we saw there was an unusual event, which was the legal barring from the Supreme Court against Lula again running for president. And by then, we had over 50% of the evangelical vote clearly directed to Lula. And there was another Pentecostal candidate, an environmental leader, who had been a woman who had been a minister in Lula's first cabinet between 2003 and 2009. And then, as a result of the general polarization and debates and conflicts that the whole juncture was fraught with, we saw this decreasing number of evangelicals deciding to support the new candidate that was put forward by the Workers' Party in place of Lula. So we end the elections with this kind of 70-30 result, and this becomes a battleground for the following years in terms of how evangelical politics plays out as far as the support or critique of Bolsonaro take shape. As another outcome of this juncture, the representation in Congress and in government of evangelicals, which is massively conservative by now, and you might imply from everything I've said, we begin to hear a discourse from the sides of power, from the state, that not just seeks to interpolate evangelicals and Christians generally, but puts itself forward as the only legitimate representative voice of Christians in the country. So that also adds to this very polarized and contested climate that we have experienced in the country. And then the pandemic strikes already in late 2019, but very clearly from March 2020, when it becomes, very clear that it's not just isolated cases we're talking about, but really an epidemic. And now, through the World Health Organization, we realized that that was a pandemic, and that becomes a new site of where all these fault lines are to be again, felt and critiques, conflicts, disputes abound around that. We see, as I will say in a few minutes, the emergence of disputes in terms of a very public discourse, including state agents, which rose questions about, the legality of that on a constitutional basis, but arguing from the position of state representatives, both legislators and public managers, on spiritual power, trust in God, defiance of the diagnosis around the growth and the spread of the virus, growth in the number of cases and so on, coupled with arguments about religious freedom, seeking to secure a space of exception for those Christians who would not accept the restrictions put in place by mostly local authorities at state and municipal levels, as opposed to the federal level of central government, which adopted what we have, became used to call negationist approaches to the pandemic. Well, finally, I think another fault line could be found in terms of a growing, gap between the question of love of neighbor and the question of true faith in the Brazilian context, leading Christians to, not just divide, along these lines, but also within them, taking different approaches about how much love of neighbor, how much true faith were at stake, and what should be done to, take decisive lines along those questions. Well, to show you very briefly now, I know that I've gone, a bit far in terms of time, but to show you some of, at least 3 cases which became very easily traceable on public media and through governmental decisions, and a number of demonstrations even. We had these 3 different major positions in terms of how churches have responded and reacted to the challenge the pandemics raised for Brazilian Christians. One very clear movement was the argument that churches must be kept open at all costs. And this became not just a claim, but also a movement, and led to all sorts of maneuvers from legislators, governments at different levels, because in some states in Brazil, there were alignments with the federal government along those lines. And the arguments here we've heard from March last year have turned around the need to provide spiritual protection and strengthening to people who were bereaved by their losses or who were in fear of getting infected and developing the more serious forms of the disease. And in that sense, the church must be kept open, because it is only in churches that spiritual protection and strengthening can be ministered to such bereaved and fearful people. Other arguments sought to argue for the opening of churches, because that would be proof that those people in churches were protected by God, would not, fall ill, and in that there would be a witness to God's power and God's protection of His own against the virus. This kind of defiant understanding of how God works, which we might say violates, the commandment not to put God to test, or not to use God's word in vain, that was prevailed in many parts of Brazil in quite spirited, sermons and pastors calling his followers to show their commitment to God. And it did not proceed too far, because it soon was clear that not by coming to church, people would find, immunity in relation to the virus. And in that sense, we've seen, particularly from the end of last year onwards, a decrease in this sort of line of reasoning. But still, the restrictions that was put in place by local authorities, state authorities, to contain the spread of the virus was challenged and contested through an argument that violated the religious freedom secured by law, constitutionally guaranteed, and so on. And then a battle between guaranteeing religious freedom and guaranteeing fundamental rights to life and to public health become a very heated spot in terms of church engagements and church discussions. On a very different line, including many Pentecostal churches not aligned to that political elite that I mentioned, formed by politicians and media-savvy giants in Brazil, we've seen many churches and most traditional evangelical churches taking a different line, arguing for love of neighbor, for the expression of solidarity as the major response Christian churches could give to the catastrophe the country was expecting. Just to give you a picture, by November 2020, Brazil had experienced 197,000 deaths. And from January to April this year, we've already counted 194,000 deaths. And we are coming very close to 400,000 deaths, which probably, as I speak, will have reached that level. And now we have a parliamentary inquiry in place seeking to investigate governmental omissions that led to such a massive number of loss of lives that we have experienced. Now, this show love of neighbor argument has been expressed in three main forms. Churches going online and remaining online for the most part of the last year, 13 months. Churches joining, on the other hand, in boldly seeking those people who became hungry or who had no support from the state. The number of homeless people again grew dramatically in Brazil, and many churches boldly started to seek to serve these groups, coming into physical nearness and contact with them, and providing food, clothing, hygienic kits, and information about how to keep themselves protected despite the very vulnerable situation they found themselves in. Thirdly, we have seen churches officially, through public statements, challenging federal government omissions, negationism, even concrete decisions taken or announced and then, retracted after public, reaction against them. And that has led to a different picture of how Christians could respond to the challenges of pandemics through a rediscovery of solidarity with the vulnerable ones, regardless of their faith. And the third position has been about defense of life as a kind of non-conditional element in the expression of Christian identity, but also in the expression of a kind of civic identity, especially over the last 3-4 months, when the second wave of the pandemic proved to be a lot more serious than we had experienced until then. Now, to round up these reflections, and this is my last slide, what does that say to us about world Christianity as a concept? I mean, we have this notion has developed over the last few years, 10, 15 years. Of course, I'm talking about not the very origin of it, but a much more widespread use of this expression to try and make sense of the diversity, varieties within Christianity across traditional denominational lines that have developed more recently. And a certain kind of proactiveness of this, of forms of Christianity that had so far been seen as somewhat backward or marginal and so on. Well, what I think the pandemics has revealed in that respect is the notion of world Christianity does not clearly make justice to the diversity of situations in which both across borders and within borders and across denominational lines and ideological lines have become part and parcel of our everyday experiences, which lead me to raise the question to what extent we need to see world Christianity as a globalist, through a globalist sense or lens, better put, in the sense that if we see Christianity spreading in many parts of the world, if we see growth changing the identities, traditional identities of Christian churches and Christian people, on the other hand, local contexts do matter. And they matter both positively and negatively as we speak about world Christianity. So the Brazilian case has been, for me, a clear experience of both things, both how the spread and the growth in new forms of Christian identity and their connections with other like-minded groups and movements across the world have represented both positive and negative, changes and trends on how we can assess the impact, the contribution of Christian churches and Christian people. Religious activism in that context has involved three very different challenges, has turned around these three areas, challenging areas, in which love of neighbor, care of creation, and prophetic voice, particularly the prophetic voice that is expressed through indictments against the existing order, both cultural, religious, and political. These three areas, they become sites of contention, but also sites in which new, fresh forms of Christian witness and reflection are emerging. They have led, for instance, to the need to engage publics beyond the boundaries of churches themselves, and seeking to expand views on what the Christian understandings of neighborliness mean, to include those minorities that had become under fire since the early 2010s, while other Christian groups see these minorities as representing a threat to Christian integrity, reframing racial and environmental issues through theological lenses. We've seen a lot more debate and discussion, even public, around theological understandings of the environment and racial divisions, and also racial equality, associated, for instance, with human rights, but also with the notion of humans as bearing the image of God and so on. And these areas have also become, areas in which new expressions of solidarity have developed, for instance, in terms of not so much providing for needs, but also developing building capacities among vulnerable, marginalized, and discriminated against people. The question this all raises for us is, how can we come to frame, to understand the stranger as neighbor? And I think a major challenge that the pandemics has raised for Brazilian Christians, particularly under this conservative reaction that we have been immersed in, is how to think of the neighbor as a non-territorial notion, as an intersectional notion of the human other, who's not necessarily close to us physically, who does not necessarily look like us as Christians of this or that walk of life, but confronts us with the nearness of his or her needs, with the nearness of his or her vulnerability, and with the nearness of his or her difference. And that is a challenge to reckon with. Finally, this has also raised questions for how churches themselves, within themselves, live together, because the polarizing climate that we have experienced over 10 years now or more has exposed publicly, because of the very visibility that Christians, particularly Pentecostal and evangelicals, have achieved in public life in Brazil. This has all raised a very painful question of the scandal of polarization among Christians. Christian churches dividing along lines of how they understand racial, gender, sexual, and ideological differences. And this is what I would like to leave as a final reflection for us as we think about the challenge of solidarity that the pandemic has put before Christians, particularly in the context I'm speaking from. Thank you very much.